Hey gang, Voltie here and welcome back to the classroom. Today we're going to be talking about building a better 7-point Highlander mana base. Now this is a very interesting topic because on the surface it seems very simple, and for the most part there'll be many people who won't get too much out of this video. But if you're a newer player, if you're entering the 7-point Highlander scene and you're still working on brewing your own decks, for example, this might be the video for you. There's a lot of intricacies to making sure that you get the most out of your mana base in a format as powerful as 7-point Highlander, and I think that's really clear because of the Highlander distinction. Having one of each card really makes the impact of each card on average lower, which means if you can increase that impact via smart deck building decisions, then you can probably gain quite a lot of equity over your opponents. So to start things off, what does it mean to have a good mana base? The ability to cast your spells is the primary purpose of your mana base. Is that it? Not quite. I understand that for the most part this title and this video might seem like clickbait, but there actually are a lot of meaningful decisions to be made and a lot of meaningful choices that come about, as well as plenty of room for deck building expression. So what does it really mean? The ability to cast your spells on time. Now, we're going to talk about this in particular when we get to the slide, but in practical terms, the ability to cast the spells in your deck is a requirement for the functionality of your mana base. The ability for your spells to be cast when appropriate as you draw them is the sign of a good mana base. So on the one hand, you might have 4 sources in your deck that are able to put Sheoldred the Apocalypse on the stack, but the amount of lands you play in your deck and the likelihood that you get to 4 mana on turn 4 is part of your mana base. Making sure that when you hit your 4th land, it comes into play untapped and either gives you your 2nd black pip or you already have your 2 black pips ready to go. All of this is part of being able to cast your spells on time. The ability to function under hate. This is really important for 7-point Highlander as well as a lot of the other Eternal formats. In formats like Standard and Pioneer, it's very unlikely that your mana base is going to be under significant duress. However, in a format like Highlander, where we have access to every card in Magic the Gathering, you're going to see a lot more non-games where someone is simply not able to cast their spells, and making sure that you are able to still cast your spells or are able to interact with the hate meaningfully is an important piece. Provides utility. So on the one hand, having lands that make mana is incredibly important. On the other hand, having lands that don't make mana or having lands that make fewer colors of mana in order to provide some kind of external utility, this is really important. How many pieces of utility you can have in your mana base is mostly deck dependent. Sometimes it's metagame dependent as well, but we'll get to that when we get to that slide. Powerful. So if your mana base is 19 basics, you're going to be able to cast all your spells on time. So if you have 19 mountains and all of your lands, all of your spells are red, you're going to be able to cast your spells, and ideally you're going to be able to cast them on time. However, there's no innate power coming from your mana base, and if possible, you should be seeking to include some power in your mana base, if possible. Synergistic. So if your deck has some kind of core functionality, and there's a lot of internal synergy between cards that have lower power level, Ornithopter is the prime example of this. On face value, the card is not good. However, if your deck is built that it needs an Ornithopter, then putting it in your deck does increase your equity. There are plenty of ways you can get synergy out of your mana base as well. Obviously, again, deck dependent. If your deck is just casting spells on time, there's probably no need for synergy, but it is definitely a way to get an edge out of your mana base. And lastly, flexibility. If your mana base is able to be used in multiple ways, this is going to give you a bit more optionality during the game and make sure that you have access to as many resources as possible as the game goes on. It'll make more sense when we get to the slide. So casting your spells on time, here are 8 black-red lands that all have some kind of viability across their different formats. Each of them has seen play in either Standard or Pioneer or Modern or other forms of constructed formats, but I think it's really clear that the power level of each of these lands and their ability to cast your spells on time shows how the order of lands comes about. So Badlands is obviously top of the pile, but Blood Crypt is as close to Badlands as you can get. There are plenty of other lands that might seem like they're close to Badlands that don't have a downside, but when you need to make sure that you have black or red mana, Blood Crypt is going to do the job. Raucous Theatre is an interesting discussion point, and I wanted to put it on this slide. While it does come into play tapped, and it does change your spell timing, the fact that it gives you utility while also being a dual land is why it's in consideration. However, it's something to be mindful of when building a deck. The more lands you have that come into play tapped and provide utility, the less likely you are to cast your spells on time. We then have Blackcleave Cliffs. If your deck curves out at 3, this card is perfect. If you have a lot of 4 and 5 drops, there are going to be plenty of games where this doesn't come into play untapped and it loses you the game. Blazemire Verge is one of the new printings. It is functionally a Badlands if you have a mountain or swamp in play. However, if it's your first land, because it doesn't have either of those types, it will only make black mana. If all of your 1-drops are black, so you've got Netherglyph and discard spells and Fatal Push, it's fine. If you have red 1-drops, you might want to eschew the Blazemire Verge. We then have Sulphurous Springs, which has obviously Badlands text, but it does you damage, so it's closer to Blood Crypt than I would say Blackcleave Cliffs is. We have Haunted Ridge, which is the reverse of Blackcleave Cliffs. It's seen a lot of play in Pioneer, but if you are planning to cast your spells in the early turns, then Haunted Ridge is not going to be the go. And then Lava Claw Reaches, which provides a different form of utility to Raucous Theatre, but I wanted to make it mentioned here because when you consider what your mana base looks like, you need to consider what spells am I trying to cast, when am I trying to cast them, and what can I do in the meantime. So listed here are a certain group of cards that interact with lands or hate on lands, and making sure that your deck functions under these pieces is critical to make sure that you aren't just left stone cold in some matchups. Now, Strip Mine here is representative not of, oh, I need to have a land in play that somehow is indestructible to beat Strip Mine. It's more that the more mana sources you have in your deck, the less powerful Strip Mine becomes. Wasteland, Magus of the Moon, and Blood Moon all represent the ability to remove a dual-colored land and make it invalid. The easy way to check these is to have more basics in your deck. Harbinger of the Seas does have very similar text to Magus of the Moon, and I think it's of note that depending on which of these two colors you are or aren't, so if you're Abzan, it doesn't matter obviously, but if you are red, or if you are blue, or if you are both, you might want to make meaningful decisions about your basics choice to play around these cards. Back to Basics is another example. If you have too many lands that come into play tapped naturally, Back to Basics is going to punish you much more than if you were to play a Tropical Island, use it for mana 1 turn to play a mana dork, and then play out from under the Back to Basics. Thalia, Heretic Cathar. This is another hate piece that does show up a fair bit, but it's more representative of making sure that your mana comes into play untapped as often as possible, and that you have the ability to have basics in play or in your hand in order to play critical spells on time. Nullrod is the last piece here, and you might think that it doesn't interact with lands, but because we have things like Seed of the Synod and Grave Furnace and Treasure Vault that see quite a lot of play, making sure that you have a critical mass of artifact lands in your deck for your deck to function, while also having a critical mass of non-artifact lands in order to beat the null rods that you're almost certainly going to see post-board, is a neat balancing act that I think people need to be mindful of. Providing utility, now this is non-exhaustive, there are so many lands that do things, but I think the key differences between these lands are what I really want to highlight here. So Caracas is the cream of the crop in my opinion. It's a plains that also has upside. Now, when you think of a utility land, the more colors it makes that are in the more colors that it makes that cast your spells, the less reliant you are on its ability to make full use of it. So if you're playing a Grixis deck and you have a Caracas in your deck and it doesn't cast anything except for colorless mana, then you're losing a lot of equity there if your opponent doesn't play legendary creatures. If you're in a white deck and Caracas can cast Mother of Runes on turn 1, then the downside is much more negligible. We then have another Surveil land. Again, the fact that it makes 2 colors and ETB is tapped and surveils 1. All of these are pieces of the puzzle, and I think it's very neat that these cards have been making it into Highlander, although it is of note that they do come with a real cost. Boseiju provides utility at the cost of a land drop. So if you play Boseiju, it will be a forest, it'll tap for green, but you will not get any of the utility out of it that you otherwise would, which essentially makes Boseiju a modal spell. So Caracas is both modes at the same time. It's both a plains and also a Caracas. Boseiju is either a forest or a disenchant. And I think it's really notable here to make sure that your utility lands don't come at too high of a cost when it actually comes to gameplay. Arena of Glory is a new piece of the puzzle here. It ETB taps unless you control a mountain, so you do have to facilitate it, but otherwise it's a mountain with upside, and the reason that this card is seeing so much play is that its utility is as close to free as possible. It's essentially just a mountain that comes into play tapped if it's your first land, but otherwise it gives you meaningful text. We then have Mystic Sanctuary, which is an upgraded island. Gives you a lot of utility, but does come with deck building costs. You have to make sure you have a critical mass of islands, which then makes you weaker to choke. We have Urza Saga, which is incredibly powerful and provides you a lot of utility across all 3 modes. But the downside is that it's colorless, it's an enchantment, so it can be blown up. It loses to a lot of the land hate like Blood Moon effects. So again, interesting deck building choice. I've added Library here because essentially this is a waste that wins you the game 5% of the time when it's in your opening hand and you're able to activate it. If your deck is able to support wastes and in our format able to spare a point and you have a Library of Alexandria in your collection, it's noteworthy. We then have Dryad Arbor. This is a forest that's also a creature, which comes with a lot of synergy, but the downside being that one of your land drops can come into play tapped, ostensibly, and also be removed. So making sure that enough of your lands provide utility, that you're not spewing equity, while also making sure that that utility is being covered and that you're not paying the costs to get that utility too often, or at least that the cost is manageable. We then have powerful. This is very simple. All of these lands make a lot of mana. If you have the ability to support lands that make a lot of mana, you probably should be doing so. So Tolarian Academy is obviously the prime example of this, but a lot of these others also make multiple pips of mana under different circumstances. One thing that is noteworthy is Gaia's Cradle, because it doesn't always appear in these decks, and is a card that appears in its own archetypes pretty frequently. If you have the ability to have a land in your deck that does something really broken, like make more than 1 mana, you should probably be playing it if possible. Synergistic. So here we have a bunch of lands that interact with your deck construction. A lot of these are from the utility slide, but they do have meaningful differences when I'm discussing them here. So the fact that Urza Saga makes artifact creatures, and those artifact creatures are large, and you get to have a toolbox effect to search your library for an artifact card, this card requires you to build your deck in such a way that you want an Urza Saga. That's the key thing here. Caracas, for example, if you have legendary creatures in your deck, or in your considering pile, or they're the 80th card, for example, having a Caracas in your deck gives more value to legendary creatures in your own deck because you can protect them with its second ability. We then have Seed of the Synod. It's an artifact land, but otherwise it's an island. We have Arena of Glory. Giving haste is very relevant, and if you have the ability to give haste to a creature that is otherwise far less potent without it, then playing that creature when you have Arena of Glory over another creature that already has haste can lead you to make better deck building decisions. We then have Cavern of Souls. If you're playing a lot of creatures in the same type and you need them to resolve, play Cavern of Souls. If you have the ability to support a wastes when you don't have one of those creatures, you can offset the Cavern that way. If you don't have a critical mass of non-creature spells, then Cavern can also be supported by just adding colorless mana for your bigger spells. I've got a Snow Island here. There are plenty of snow synergies that exist in Magic. The most notable ones in our particular format are Arkham's Astrolabe, and Icefang Coatl, and notably having an island that doesn't have the name island because it has the name Snow-Covered Island does help with things like Tainted Pact as well. We then have Dryad Arbor. This can be sacked to natural order, it can be green sunsed for, it can attack and block, it can help you sacrifice a creature in response to a Sheoldred's Edict. And then we have Academy Ruins here. Again, this is not a comprehensive list, but if you're playing artifacts that might hit the graveyard, or if you're playing an artifact-based combo deck and you want to be able to recur your artifact pieces if they get countered, then Academy Ruins is a waste with quite a lot of upside. We then have flexibility, and you might note here that a lot of these aren't lands, although they do function as lands ostensibly. So we have Lorien Revealed, Troll of Khazad-dûm, and Generous Ent. Oliphant used to see play, but it's kind of fallen off quite a lot, and Eagles of the North has never seen play. These are tapped lands, so they're tapped islands that have a different mode if you draw them in the later game. So if you pay mana to get an island with Lorien Revealed, then that's essentially a tapped island. You might have to warp the way that you think about it, but it's as close to accurate as possible. And then having that tapped island in your deck, you are able to turn it into 3 cards for 5 mana if you flood out. This is the same with Troll, this is the same with Generous Ent. Obviously these two have other applications with reanimation spells. We then have Sundering Eruption and Sink into Stupor and Emeria's Call. These are spells that can be played as lands. So for Sundering Eruption and Sink into Stupor, these are from the MH3 cycle, where you can take 3 damage to have them come into play untapped as a mountain, or you can have them come into play tapped. These are essentially lands that have a different mode as well, although they have the ability to be untapped, so rather than being a tapped island, Sink into Stupor is an untapped island. However, the spells themselves are weaker to compensate. We then have Tranquil Thicket here. This is to represent a land that has multiple modes and comes with a downside in order to facilitate that. Whether or not you can play a cycling land, the Triomes used to see a lot of play, for example, is deck dependent, but it's noteworthy that having a land that has the ability to do something else is really key to improving your mana bases. And then we have Horizon Canopy. This is probably the closest in application to just being a Savannah. You'll take a bit of damage, you'll make some mana, and then at some point you can draw a card. There are 5 other canopies in the enemy colors. And if you can support one of these and the card draw is helpful and the pain isn't too difficult, they can be a nice addition. So now we know what we need to do with our mana base. You want to be able to do all of these things, or at the very least do some of these things while building your mana base. There are a lot of lands in Magic the Gathering, and basically all of them are legal in our format, and making sure that you're getting the most out of your mana base in terms of casting your spells, while also making sure that, you know, your opponent having the ability to do something with some of their lands is being matched by yourself. You want to make sure that every edge you can have during deck building is available to you. So where do we go from here? Yeah, play all of your fetch lands. These are the best thing in every single category. They are the best lands of all time, and I want to reiterate, I hate them. This video was brought to you with the help of my lovely patrons and donors. If you'd like to see your name up here on screen, there's some links down below that you can check out to support the channel. If you are watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing. It would mean a lot to me, and it will help you stay notified of my content. It's also free and doesn't cost you anything. At the moment, I'm trying to hit 200 subs. We hit 100 a couple of weeks ago, but now we're at 140, which is really, really good growth. And so hopefully we can hit 200 sometime in January. But otherwise, that's it from me. Voltie out.